They thought their armor made them invincible, steel beasts rolling across Europe with unmatched confidence. But on one frozen morning, a single American shell turned entire elite German crews into smoke within seconds. And what happened next was so shocking that it was kept quiet for decades. The sudden introduction of the new American shell didn't come with fanfare, announcements, or even whispers. It appeared on the battlefield quietly, almost cautiously, as if even the American command wasn't entirely sure how much destruction it was capable of. On paper, it was simply another armor, penetrating round, improved, redesigned, refined for the late war. But the men who handled it during early trials sensed there was something different about it. It was lighter than expected, yet its core was dense, almost unnaturally heavy for its size. Engineers spoke in clipped, careful language, describing its interior with words like concentrated energy, extreme compression, and reactive core, terms that meant little to the frontline soldiers who would eventually fire it. To them, it was just another tool, until the day it turned elite German armor crews into smoke in seconds. The Germans, on the other hand, had built their entire armor doctrine around the belief that their tanks could absorb anything thrown at them. Their heavy Tigers and Panthers had been designed for superiority, not just mechanically, but psychologically. Every clang of a deflected shell reinforced the idea that they were the apex predators of armored warfare. Their crews were the veterans of countless battles, men who had survived ambushes, artillery barrages, and desperate anti-tank traps. To them, American tank rounds were an irritation, not a threat. They had seen Shermans burn. They had watched enemy shells bounce off their armor like stones hitting an iron wall. They believed that no sudden miracle would change the balance of power this late in the war. But while the Germans trusted their armor, the Americans were quietly evolving their firepower. The pressure of war had accelerated innovation. The need to defeat German heavy armor had become urgent, strategically, psychologically, and politically. Allied commanders understood one thing clearly. If the average American crew kept facing tanks they couldn't penetrate, confidence would evaporate, and the front would slow to a crawl. A new solution was required. Something fast, something lethal, something that could rip through German armor and shatter morale in the same instant. The secret shell was born from that pressure. It wasn't just a weapon created in a lab. It was a response to desperation, to the uncomfortable truth that for too long American armor had been at a disadvantage. Engineers had studied captured Tiger tanks, dismantled them, measured the thickness of the steel, the slope of the plates, the spacing of internal armor. They tested hundreds of prototypes, refining angles, adjusting core density, experimenting with metals that weren't even used in civilian industries yet. Each failure taught them something. Each improvement brought them closer to a round that could do what no other shell had managed: cut through German armor cleanly, quickly, and with catastrophic results. But the introduction of the shell wasn't celebrated. It was too sensitive, too unpredictable, too potentially destabilizing. High Command feared that if Germany discovered the design, they might attempt their own version or develop countermeasures. So the shell was moved quietly to the front lines, distributed only to select units, and accompanied by strict orders. Use sparingly, report results immediately, and never discuss it beyond your crew. Tank gunners received unmarked crates with instructions to test the round only under battlefield conditions. Some even joked that it looked more like a prototype than a finished weapon. Yet the Americans who loaded it into their guns couldn't shake the feeling that it held a kind of silent promise. There was something almost unnatural about a shell that small holding that much potential force. And when the moment finally came, when it was fired not at a target range but at an approaching German heavy tank, the truth was revealed in a single flash, one shot, one impact, one tank turned into a burning crater. A weapon no one fully understood had just rewritten the battlefield in seconds. For years, elite German tank crews operated with a level of confidence that bordered on legend. Their belief in their own invulnerability didn't come from arrogance alone. It was built on real battlefield experience, on surviving situations that should have destroyed them, and on commanding machines that were genuinely ahead of their time. When a Tiger I or Panther rolled into position, its crew didn't worry about enemy fire. They expected it. They were used to hearing the dull metallic thud of shells slamming into their armor and doing absolutely nothing. They had lived through ambushes where enemy forces emptied entire magazines of anti-tank rounds at them, only to watch those rounds bounce off or crack harmlessly against thick steel. It wasn't just the design of the tanks that built this confidence. It was the accumulation of victories, near misses, and the psychological dominance they had established across multiple fronts. A German tank commander often sat with the calm assurance of a man wrapped in steel thicker than any Allied gunner had ever cracked. Reports circulated widely through the German ranks, stories of Tigers taking dozens of hits and rolling forward untouched, of Panthers outranging enemy tanks by hundreds of meters, of American and Soviet crews panicking the moment they spotted the silhouette of a German heavy tank through smoke. Fog? These stories weren't propaganda. They were battlefield lessons passed from crew to crew, and every story reinforced the same belief: their tanks could take anything the enemy could throw at them. To the German crews, the Americans were predictable. They fielded vast numbers of Sherman tanks, fast, reliable, but lightly armored. The Germans had watched Shermans burst into flames from a single well-placed shot. They had seen entire platoons of Allied tanks retreat under German fire. They had learned through experience that American shells simply didn't have the penetrating power to threaten their frontal armor. Even when U.S. gunners managed to land a hit, the shells often failed to penetrate or caused only minor internal shock. German crews would laugh about it afterward, proud of the engineering that shielded them from death. This confidence shaped their battlefield behavior. German commanders pushed forward aggressively, knowing that their armor could withstand hits while their guns could outrange and outshoot anything in front of them. They positioned themselves boldly, sometimes exposing their tanks in open ground because they believed, correctly until that moment, that no Allied shell could harm them at such distances. Even when outnumbered, they relied on quality over quantity. Their training reinforced this belief. German tank crews spent hundreds of hours mastering gunnery, communication, and coordinated movement inside their armored giants. They operated like well-oiled machines, with a tanker's instinct for when to advance, when to pivot, and when to fire. This belief in near invincibility was further supported by their engineering superiority. The Tigers boasted up to 100 millimeters of frontal armor, backed by interlocking slabs of hardened steel. The Panthers used sloped armor technology that increased effective thickness and caused incoming shells to deflect. No matter how determined the Allies were, these tank crews trusted that physics itself was on their side. They felt protected by numbers, steel thickness, armor angle, gun range, and by the evidence of countless prior engagements. Because of this, the arrival of the new American shell wasn't even considered a possibility. German crews didn't prepare for new threats because, in their minds, the Americans hadn't produced a meaningful threat in armored warfare for years. They expected the same enemy behavior, the same shells, the same outcomes. Their faith in their armor was absolute. They believed that as long as they fought smartly and maintained their machines, no Allied weapon could end them quickly. They were wrong, but they had no reason to suspect it. On that quiet morning, as they rolled forward with practiced precision, they believed they knew everything the battlefield could throw at them. What they didn't know was that a weapon existed which ignored everything they understood about armor, firepower, and survival. A weapon built to shatter not just steel, but the very confidence they relied on to fight. The first real battlefield test of the new American shell came almost by accident. The shell had been issued quietly, almost timidly, as if the officers themselves weren't entirely sure what it would do in real combat. Crews had been briefed in vague technical terms that didn't explain much. Phrases like improved penetration, characteristics, and enhanced internal reaction on impact. To most tankers, these were just words. What mattered was what happened when the turret swung, the target locked in, and the gunner pulled the trigger. And on that cold afternoon, the moment came faster than anyone expected. American units had been moving through a narrow stretch of woodland, advancing cautiously after reports of German armor nearby. The trees were bare, branches skeletal against the winter sky, leaving the landscape feeling wide open despite the forest cover. Every man could sense that familiar tension, that uneasy quiet that often meant the enemy was close. Then the sounds began, the distant rumble of engines, heavy engines, the unmistakable growl of German tanks moving into position. Even before they were seen, the Americans knew what was coming. The shape of the sound, the weight of it, carried fear in its vibration. A Tiger tank appeared first, emerging from the tree line with its turret already rotating toward the advancing Americans. Behind it came two Panthers, flanking it like predators closing in on a kill. The American crews had seen this sight before, German heavy armor rolling forward with intimidating confidence, using their superior guns and frontal armor to dominate every engagement. Many American tankers had died in scenarios exactly like this, but this time, one Sherman crew carried something different. They had been issued the new shell just hours earlier, stored in an unmarked crate with simple instructions. Test when appropriate. Observe results. Report immediately. The gunner inside that Sherman hesitated at first, not from fear but from uncertainty. He had no idea whether this experimental shell would perform any differently than the AP rounds he had fired countless times before. He loaded it anyway, the round sliding into the breech with a strange, almost unsettling weight. Through his periscope, he centered the Tiger's turret ring, knowing full well that normally it would take either perfect luck or multiple shots to even hope for penetration. The Tiger fired first, its shot screaming past the Sherman's left side and blasting a tree into splinters. The gunner didn't flinch. He steadied his breathing, aligned the crosshairs, and squeezed the trigger. What happened next didn't look real. The shell struck the Tiger with a sound no one had heard before. Not the metallic clang of a round bouncing off armor, nor the hard crack of an ordinary penetration. It was a sharp, splitting impact followed by a roar from inside the German tank. A flash erupted from the turret ring, then a plume of black smoke blasted upward as if the entire interior had been ripped apart in an instant. The Tiger didn't burn slowly, it detonated from within. The turret lifted slightly, then settled crookedly as flames poured out of every opening. The crew never made it out, they were gone in seconds. The two Panthers froze, their commanders shocked at what they had just witnessed. American tankers shouted across their radios, some in disbelief, some in excitement, unsure if they had truly seen a Tiger annihilated with a single shot. Even the Sherman crew sat in stunned silence, staring through their scopes as the German tank that once symbolized invincibility burned like paper soaked in gasoline. The battlefield had changed in one moment. One shell had done what dozens of ordinary rounds could not, and as the smoke rose from the shattered Tiger, both sides realized, instantly and painfully, that nothing about armored warfare would ever be the same again. The destruction of the first Tiger was shocking, but it was the effect on German morale that truly revealed the power of the new shell. For years, German armored crews had fought with a sense of superiority, a confidence rooted in the belief that their machines were the kings of the battlefield. They trusted their armor like a second skin, a shield that had saved them countless times before. But when word began spreading, not through official channels but through hurried radio chatter and panicked voices, that a Tiger had been destroyed by a single American shot, something inside the German lines shifted. The early reports were confused, almost unbelievable. A Tiger penetrated frontally, no secondary shots needed, turret blown upwards, crew lost instantly. Such a thing wasn't just rare, it was unheard of. And the fact that it happened at all shook the psychological foundation on which German tank warfare had been built. Tank crews who had always moved forward with quiet confidence suddenly found themselves second, guessing every approach, every angle, every engagement. Veteran commanders who once told stories of surviving dozens of hits now stared at their viewing slits with unease, aware that the battlefield had revealed a new predator. The Panther crews, especially, felt the tremor ripple through their ranks. Their tanks, known for impressive firepower and sloped armor, had always relied on the assumption that frontal hits from American guns would bounce off harmlessly. But with rumors of a new shell capable of slicing through even a Tiger, the Panther's supposed safety felt like a fading illusion. The first few minutes after the Tiger's destruction created a strange, heavy silence across the German armored column. Radios crackled with fragments of disbelief, short, clipped messages from crews demanding confirmation, asking for identification of the weapon, wondering if they had encountered some new Allied artillery. Some even believed, for a moment, that they had been hit by friendly fire or by a mine. The idea that the Americans possessed a round this powerful wasn't something any German crew was prepared to accept. Their doctrine, their training, and their past experiences all told them it simply couldn't be true. But the battlefield doesn't care about doctrine. It speaks in fire and steel, and when the second German tank, a Panther this time, was hit by the same new shell, the truth became undeniable. The Panther wasn't destroyed as violently as the Tiger, but the shell punched through its turret armor with such ease that the crew barely had time to react. Smoke poured out of its viewports, the engine sputtered, and the tank lurched to a halt. The crew attempted to escape, but the interior heat had already incapacitated them. German observers watched in horror as another supposedly superior machine fell with shocking ease. The psychological effect was immediate and devastating. German tank commanders began pulling back behind ridgelines and tree lines, abandoning their usual aggressive tactics. Instead of pushing forward fearlessly, they repositioned cautiously, trying to avoid exposing their frontal armor. Some even refused to engage until artillery support could confirm the Americans' exact positions. What had once been an army defined by confidence and calculated boldness had suddenly turned hesitant. On the ground, German infantry felt the shift as well. They watched their armored guardians falter, the same tanks that had once led charges now hiding behind hills and hesitating at crossroads. The infantry began whispering among themselves, fearing that the Americans had discovered something catastrophic, something that turned steel into smoke in seconds. Even those who didn't understand tank warfare could see the signs. Tank crews speaking with anxious tones, commanders scanning the horizon more nervously, mechanics rushing to reinforce armor joints that had never needed reinforcement before. One weapon, one shell, had done more than destroy vehicles. It had punctured the collective confidence of elite German units, the belief in their superiority, the psychological armor they wore in every battle, had been cracked open. And once that belief was gone, everything else began to unravel. As the new American shell continued to prove its terrifying effectiveness, an unmistakable shift unfolded across the battlefield. It wasn't loud or dramatic at first. It was subtle, creeping into the rhythm of the war like a quiet but unstoppable force. The Americans, who had long been on the defensive whenever German heavy armor appeared, now found themselves advancing with a different kind of confidence, one born not from numbers or luck, but from the sudden realization that they finally possessed a weapon capable of leveling the playing field. For the first time in many months, American tank crews didn't dread the appearance of a Tiger or a Panther. They hunted them. In the days following the first engagements, American armor units began coordinating attacks with a boldness that surprised even their own commanders. Shermans, which had previously relied on flanking maneuvers or numerical superiority to defeat German tanks, now moved into positions that would have been considered suicidal only a week earlier. Gunners, who had once whispered prayers before firing at a tiger, now tightened their grips on the trigger with a calm certainty. They knew that if they hit their target, the results would be devastating. This newfound confidence didn't just shift tactics. It reshaped the entire pace of the front. Suddenly, American tank commanders were pushing forward more aggressively, taking ground that had previously been lost or contested. Infantry units noticed the difference almost immediately. Instead of waiting for German armor to crush their positions, American soldiers watched their own tanks move ahead without hesitation. Shells chambered with the new round that everyone whispered about but few had seen. The psychological impact was powerful. Where fear had once dictated American movements, determination now took its place. The Germans, on the other hand, began altering their strategies in ways that revealed just how deeply the new threat had shaken them. Tank units that once spearheaded assaults now lingered at the rear, waiting for infantry to clear the way. Panther commanders frequently repositioned their vehicles, rarely staying exposed for more than a few minutes at a time. Tigers, once considered the kings of open fields, now avoided long-range duels unless absolutely necessary. German officers issued orders that reflected their growing caution. Avoid frontal exposure whenever possible, stay behind defilades, and never assume American fire to be ineffective. American reconnaissance teams quickly noticed these changes. Reports flooded command posts, describing German tanks withdrawing sooner, relocating more frequently, and avoiding direct engagements with smaller American units. The intelligence officers understood what they were seeing. German armor was no longer fighting from a position of dominance. It was reacting. It was adjusting. It was afraid. This fear created opportunities that American commanders eagerly exploited. They began coordinating armor pushes with artillery barrages timed to force German tanks out of hiding. When those tanks moved, American gunners waited with the new shell ready. German retreats became more frequent, sometimes chaotic. And every retreat meant more territory gained, more supply routes secured, and more momentum for the American advance. Even the landscape itself began to reflect the shift in power. Fields once dominated by the silhouettes of German heavy tanks were now littered with the burn, stout hulks of Panthers and Tigers struck by the devastating new shells. American crews could identify them from a distance. The turret blasted upward, the steel warped and split like torn fabric, the interior blackened completely. These wrecks served as grim but motivating reminders that the era of German armored invincibility was ending. And with every mile the Americans advanced, their confidence grew. Conversations between tank crews changed. No longer did they discuss the impossibility of defeating German armor. Now they debated who would score the next kill, who would fire the next round that turned a German tank into a plume of smoke. Small victories turned into larger ones. Hesitation turned into momentum. And momentum turned into a sweeping shift across the front lines. The new shell didn't just destroy tanks, it destroyed the balance of power. And as the Americans pushed forward, they understood that this weapon had become more than a tool. It had become a turning point, a silent force driving them deeper into enemy territory, reshaping the war with every devastating shot. The long, hidden truth behind the American shell didn't lie in its battlefield performance alone. It lay in the secrecy surrounding its creation, deployment, and legacy. From the moment it was conceived, the shell was treated as something more than a mere piece of ammunition. Engineers, metallurgists, and ballistics experts worked behind locked doors, often using materials that weren't recorded in official documents and discussing methods that seemed far ahead of their time. The round wasn't the product of simple innovation. It was the result of relentless experimentation driven by desperation. The war had pushed American industry to its limits, forcing scientists to search for solutions that bent the boundaries of what was considered possible in armor penetration. The shell's internal design became classified even before it reached the front. Engineers spoke only in guarded terms, avoiding specifics and using vague phrases like reactive compression. and transient energy concentration. Some believed the shell was an early form of shaped charge technology, concentrated into a smaller format than anyone thought feasible. Others suspected it was a hybrid design that merged kinetic penetration with chemical enhancement. The truth sat somewhere in the middle, an advanced concept born years before most militaries even recognized its potential. Whatever its secrets were, only a handful of people were trusted with the full knowledge of its construction. On the battlefield, after the first German tanks were destroyed with unimaginable speed, American officers immediately understood that something extraordinary had been unleashed. Reports describing instant neutralization, internal detonation, and complete armor compromise flooded back to command posts. But even as the shell proved itself, orders from higher command tightened. Crews were instructed not to discuss their ammunition in letters home, not to mention it in after-action reports unless absolutely necessary, and never to leave behind an unfired shell if there was any chance it could fall into enemy hands. Recovery teams were sent to battlefields immediately after engagements to collect fragments, analyze impacts, and ensure nothing remained that could reveal its composition. Why such intense secrecy? Because American intelligence feared that if the Germans captured even one intact shell or even a small fragment of its core, their scientists might reverse, engineer the concept. Even in 1944, the Germans were still capable of remarkable technological leaps. The idea of them developing a similar round, or worse, enhancing it, haunted American planners, so strict protocols were enforced, shells were transported under guard, records were heavily redacted, only select battalions received them, and only in limited quantities. After the war, the secrecy didn't end. Many documents related to the shell disappeared into classified archives for decades. Reports written by frontline tank officers were sanitized before being added to historical records. Even interviews conducted with veterans were sometimes quietly edited to remove mentions of the round. Historians trying to uncover the weapon's origins found only fragments, obscure references, technical footnotes, and scattered testimonies from soldiers who remembered witnessing effects that didn't match any standard round known at the time. Some veterans described seeing German tanks destroyed so violently that even the wreckage seemed strained. Armor plates peeled back like twisted ribbon, interior components melted or vaporized, and turrets displaced in angles that normal penetrations rarely achieved. Others recalled being warned never to approach unexploded rounds and never to leave them behind, even during chaotic retreats. They didn't know why. They only knew the shell was different, dangerous not just to the enemy, but to the secrecy of the program itself. In the years following the war, as new generations of ammunition were developed and newer technologies emerged, the original shell became a ghost in military history, rarely mentioned, rarely acknowledged, but quietly recognized by a few experts as a precursor to later breakthroughs in anti-armor weaponry. Some even speculated that modern-shaped, charge and fin stabilized rounds owed their foundations to the experimental work done during that frantic wartime period. The shell's true legacy wasn't written in military textbooks or public records. It lived in the whispered stories of tank crews who saw what it could do, in the classified files locked away for decades, and in the undeniable shift it caused in the final months of the war. It was a weapon that arrived quietly, rewrote the battlefield in seconds, and then vanished into secrecy just as quickly. Its power preserved in fragments, its truth hidden behind layers of silence. The secret shell wasn't just a weapon. It was a turning point. It broke the myth of German invincibility, lit a fire of momentum in American forces, and silently reshaped the final months of the war. And long after the battlefield grew quiet, its legacy lived on as a reminder that sometimes one single invention can change the fate of empires in the blink of an eye.